Song of Mornius, Chapter 35. Filrina fought with her meager reserves, battled hands of power, hands smaller than her own, yet incredibly strong. With a strength she could not comprehend, he clasped her to his breast. She gasped at the feeling of his crystal staff when it bumped her skin, cried in dismay as the staff ignited, its white fire joining with currents she'd never seen before, a force outside old magic or new. The power of time transcended all else. Even warders fell to its will, yet the staff sensed its current, latched onto it in flight, and rode with it, carrying her, carrying him and the giant through the here and now, the past and possible futures. Unable to see through her tears, she felt with her nerves the staff's clench of power. It bucked in his hands, quivered as it re-established. At once he walked forward, as though familiar with his surroundings. Filrina struggled to focus, see where he went. Branches swiped at her knees, at his arms holding her, one around her shoulders, the other under her knees, with that hand holding his staff. Ahead she glimpsed the giant's broad shoulders, her single tangled braid as it swung back and forth. Filrina turned her face to the elf mage's chest. Soon Tarek would see her, after so many years. Like the giant, she would see loathing on his face, contempt and desire for her death. She quelled the whimper in her throat. It was fitting, she decided with her one good eye squeezed shut. Better to die at the hands of the man she had cherished than to strengthen even more her father's slayer. At least her ruined vision would spare her the agony of completely beholding his expression. Tarek's love for her shattering forever from his face. No torture by men's could ever have pained her so much. The elf mage quickened his strides as the forest thinned out. Wind slapped her face, pulled at her mud-caked hair. From a distance she heard a yell, "Avalar!" "I will do what I can." Filrina heard the winged elf murmuring above her head, "You have suffered enough, but I cannot, I regret, promise you anything." Filrina lifted her arm to cover her face. The giant shouted, then broke into a run, a swift, rhythmic crunching across the snow. The mage followed at a walk, as if he too dreaded the coming ordeal. Wind pressed his long white hair against her ear. She breathed his spicy elf scent, at once familiar and yet so alien. With a flash of insight she understood what made him familiar. Warder's fire gnawed through his bones, stronger even than the blackness within herself. Carefully he kept it shielded from the world, surrounded by layers of the same foreign magic she had beheld within his staff. A small fire crackled below her and to the right. Branches caught at her robe, threatening to rip the heavy black cloth. Then bodies closed around her. Filrina listened with all her might, both waiting for and dreading the voice of Tarek Florn. Above her head the giant spoke softly. "Cameron's killer?" Tarek's voice cracked across the stunned silence. "This?" Filrina forced her sticky eye open. Still the elf held her, offering her the meager protection he could. She lacked the strength to turn her head, see Tarek's expression. Then, slowly, she was lowered. Gently the elf mage placed her beside the little fire, surrendering her with a soft sigh into the hands of human justice. She stared at the merrily burning wood, at the homey sight of the abandoned griddle and cakes going cold behind it. Through the smoke she saw a quiet face watching her, a sad young man with features she knew, had memorized from the black depths of Veeler's pool. "Avalar, are you sure?" "Yes." Steel hissed as the giant drew her sword. "She is one of Malion's strongest, so the ghost has told me. Last night he urged me from my rest to go and slay her myself. I did so, for Cameron. For him I would strike a blow, but..." Filrina heard the giant falter as she had done back on the mountain. It was this conflict of passions in the giant that had saved her in that moment. She held her breath, listening hard. Perhaps it would save her now. A boot pressed her face. Filorina groaned as, with a hard nudge, Tarek turned her head, exposing her torment of a ruined right eye. She heard him crouch down, felt hands tugging back her filthy hair. "Why?" he asked. "Malian didn't defend her? Who has done this to her?" Leather creaked as the giant swung her blade. "Should it matter?" Avalar asked. With her own 2 hands she took Cameron's life. "Her victims are many," the ghost has said. "They are crying for her blood." Calloused hands touched her, slipping their gentle coolness beneath her blood-hardened tunic. Filorina caught a glimpse of an older man's face, his intense green eyes wincing as his fingers found her wounds. The man sat back. Filorina saw him catching his breath, his face suddenly pale. "Tarek, she's badly hurt. She's all cut up. Someone has—" "Tarek Florn," came the elf mage's soft voice. "Her life or death is in your hands. Decide quickly, please. I do not enjoy this woman's suffering." Eyes burning, Filorina blinked at the vivid sky. She rolled her head, struggling to see the face she had loved. Tarek? He was on her in an instant, both hands fisting in her tunic. Standing, he dragged her erect. "How do you know my name?" He growled the question in her face. Through her tears he blazed at her, rage contorting his face. With his every word, his fingers clenched. "Do you know what you've done? What you've taken from me?" "Yes," she sobbed. "Oh, Tarek, I'm sorry." He held her, studied her. His face went white as he recognized her. His stunned eyes widened as he slowly mouthed her name. Then his grip lost his strength. He dropped her beside the fire. Filorina screamed on impact. She landed on her hands, on her twisted, shattered fingers. Sobbing, she rolled to her side and pressed her quivering hands against her stomach, curling her body around them as tight as she could. Above her, Tarek stood. She watched his hazel eyes glitter with tears, saw his confusion wound him more deeply than any magic could. She closed her good eye. With all her might she wished for death. Filorina sensed him withdraw, heard him turn from the sight of her. A cry ripped from his throat. He drew his sword, hacked savagely at the snow. "Tarek Florn," said the elf mage, "you must decide." Tarek whirled. "Cameron loved her!" he shouted. "He loved her all his life. That's how he was. That's how he loved. And she murdered him!" Filorina, clutching her knees, looked toward the fire. Across the flames the young man watched her. He was Galen Laval, the Skystone's wielder, yet there was more to his expression, something ancient behind his eyes, a power familiar, a power she knew. She trembled and could not stop. He was a warder, Hulrum, her foe, a warder not lodged in a staff or the stone of a mountain, but in flesh. He stood as if interpreting her fear as a signal. In a body that glistened with sweat, flesh haggard and drawn from illness, he moved toward her around the fire. Hard hands seized her behind her neck. She glimpsed snow sliding down bright steel, the wet tip of the blade as her captor swung it. It was familiar, Tarek's sword and Tarek's hand, which held her still. Cameron loved her, the elf said softly. What would he want? I want it! Tarek paused to shift position. With his knee he thrust her forward, smashing her bloody chest against a log. The angle of the wood forced back her chin. A foot replaced his knee. She killed Cameron! Tarek snarled. She was deceived, the elf countered. Filorina rolled back her eyes, blinked hard with her one eye trying to see. The elf mage stood with his back toward her, steam rising from his wings and shoulders. Power clenched itself in him like nothing she had felt before, from a warder she had never believed in, a warder who touched him now. Pressure climbed in her throat, writhed in the pit of her stomach. It was Malian drawing back, thrashing himself from her. It was his reaction, Malian's fear. Decide carefully, Leader Florn. The elf mage turned from his study of the trees, his violet eyes lowered to lock with hers. If you slay her now in the heat of your rage, how will you judge yourself after, once it's done? Or, the elf grimaced and shook his head, is this how criminals are treated in Kitterin? Did your leaders just slay them on sight? Tarek snarled between his teeth. The leaders of Kitterin are all dead, elf, slain by this woman, the warder she serves. A warder who must destroy to live, who must deceive the ignorant and vulnerable to get what he wants. Farina groaned at the agony in her chest, the roughness of the bark against her chin. She wished for his bright blade to drop, for this terrible moment to end. The pressure of his boot released her. With a sweep of his leg, Tarek stretched her flat onto the frozen ground beside the fire. Very well, pony, Tarek snapped. His glare hurled daggers into her heart. I'll do as you ask and wait until I'm clear and calm and reasonable. Then I will slay her myself. There are no judges anymore. I'm all she gets, and it's more than she deserves. Filrina stiffened as Galen Laval knelt beside her. No, she whimpered. Her nerves cringed from remembered pain, agonies inflicted to please a warder. Trembling, she struggled to roll away. Hands caught her shoulders. She was drawn into his lap, cradled in his arms. It is not a kindness to heal you, Horam's quiet voice said, when your future seems uncertain. But no living flesh should suffer like this. A warder has done this, one who thrives on slow death. Darkness cannot exist where there is light. When a single candle is raised, darkness will always rail against it, will summon death itself to seek to snuff it out. You are that candle, Filrina Flynn. The destroyer has turned against you. She whimpered in her throat, flinched at his touch. He was a warder holding her, a warder stroking her face. He was Horam, no longer vanquished in the staff. Horam set free upon the world, freed by Galen Laval. She clung to him as she had once yearned to embrace her god. Unlike the cold granite of Malian's home, his flesh yielded. Warm and vulnerable and human, he widened his embrace. Power rose from within him. He was Horam, fully entwined with human flesh, focusing through his staff he'd left abandoned by the fire. No longer was the Skystone his prison. Mornius' song was Horam, and to the singer she clung as a child would. Pain like 1,000 needles stabbed through her flesh, wormed her limbs, circulated her blood, knitted together her shattered nerves. Through her body his fire lanced, burning up and down, cleansing, healing, straightening, restoring. She drew a deep breath, marveling that she could do so, yet still she clung to the young man's neck. Some hurts his magic would never efface. Some memories would flail at her forever. She lay curled over his lap, her knees to her chest. Tarek stood above her, breathing hard. For the first time she could see the disgust on his face. Avalar. Eyes blazing, he glared at the sky and the nearby mountain. As the giant stepped near, he gestured without looking down. Take that out of my sight. If she tries anything. He swallowed, hands clenching at his sides. Kill her at once. Understand? Avalar nodded and sheathed her great sword. Filrina gasped as the giant seized her upper arm, the powerful fingers closing around her flesh, pressing the muscle to bone. Before she could think, she was torn from Galen's grasp. She yelped as her knees struck the log. "Sails, will you walk?" Avalar lifted her by the arm, raising her to her feet. With all her strength, Florina struggled to obey, to support her own weight, coax her revived legs into motion. She trotted at Avalar's side, half dangling from the giant's hard grasp. "My shoulder!" she cried. "Please! Ow!" "Then walk!" Avalar snarled. Stopping beside the largest of 3 tents, the giant hauled her forward. Florina grabbed at the fingers clenching her arm, fought to loosen their grip. "Please! You're hurting me!" Avalar tore open the icy door flap and then released her. "You have hurt my friends," she returned. "First Cameron, now you hurt him more by hurting his brother. Get inside!" Florina tripped over the giant's right foot. She sprawled on the furs, on the softness of someone's bed. The thought of any bed at that moment sent her scurrying into a corner. In a tight ball she huddled, trembling, arms locked around her knees. Galen was already ill, the giant told her, lowering herself in the small space to sit poised upon the furs. "Now!" She shook her head. Florina cringed under the giant's hard stare. Then, slowly, her muscles unclenched. The smell of mildew from the tent, the softness of the furs against her hands, and the distant crackle of the fire unraveled what final cords of strength she had. In exhaustion, she let herself go, let herself slump against the tent's waxed leather, her legs sliding to one side. She lay panting hoarsely, her eyes half closed. Tears trickled down her face, dropping to the leather pad beneath her. She lifted her hand. With tentative fingers she probed the new bruises the giant's hard grasp had left. The muscles still throbbed, aching under her touch. "Are you harmed?" Avalar asked quietly. Florina nodded. Slowly she sank down until her face pressed the furs. A shudder ran through her, clenching her shoulders and back. Not wanting Tarek to hear, Florina crammed her fist between her teeth, threw her free arm around her head, then sobbed and cried her misery. She lay convulsing with silent grief, listening as outside the tent activity picked up around the little camp. Munching sounds filled the woodsy clearing, the grunts and bugles of creatures she didn't know. All the while the giant watched her silently, her face impenetrable, sitting like a judge across the furs. Then Florina heard the giant speaking softly, heard the rustle of the leather door, the sound of the older man's voice who had touched her before. "Get her ready," he said. "We're heading out." Florina snatched a shaky breath and held it. The man's gentle voice soothed her, like so often her father's had done. She heard the door fall shut, heard the uneven crunch of snow as he departed. Even his footsteps calmed her heart. They gave her hope where she had none. "Florina Vlyn, these leggings are for you," said the giant. "Will you rise now and look at me?" She nodded. Trembling, Florina dragged herself to her knees, finger combing her matted hair away from her face. With hot, sore eyes, she stared at the giant. "You have suffered," Avalar said softly. "Like Pony, I do not enjoy the sight. But now I must ask you why. This power you served, was there some reason it turned against you?" Shaking her head, Florina fought not to look away. "I turned against him," she whispered. "He killed my father." "I see," said Avalar. "This explains much. The death of others, that is desirable. Because of your convictions you would gladly slay, but when it was your own father—" "No!" Florina sat trembling, her eyes wide open, gaping at a truth she could not bear. "Yes," she whispered finally. Like her father had done, she cringed inside at what she beheld. "That's exactly right. That's what I have become. A monster. She swallowed. "I wish he had killed me." He still might, Avalar said. Then she fell silent. Outside, shadows moved back and forth. Wood clicked together as the other tents were dismantled. Steam hissed from the little fire. Even through the walls of the tent, Vilrina caught the whiff of smoke. I wish you had saved him the trouble. Vilrina stared at the floor. Back on the mountain when you had the chance. She broke off as Avalar shifted sideways from the bed, then stretched toward her, placing a small pile of folded black fabric and leather where she could reach it. Put those on, Avalar said. She scooped up the furs above her blanket, went to the doorway and tossed them out. Then she returned and knelt to fold up her bed. Glancing down at her, Avalar frowned. Come, Vilrina Vlen, you cannot travel as you are, and if you continue ignoring commands, you will only give him more reason. Do you understand? Vilrina seized the leggings and lurched to her feet. With quick fingers she drew the cloth over her icy legs, then wriggled into a second pair of carefully waxed leather. As Avalar reached for her, Vilrina recoiled, her upper arm still throbbing from the first time. No! She pressed back, straining the tense, taut sides. I'll go with you. Please, just don't hurt me. Avalar searched her face, studied her fear. Very well, she said, turning. With a fist, she punched the door flap open. Vilrina, swallowing roughly at the giant's ire, pushed through the opening. Straightening her back, she blinked beneath the sky's unfeeling glare.